Starting a large painting can be very daunting, so different artists use different tools and techniques to get from that blank canvas to a finished painting. So for me, I'll go through my general recipe that I do and show you how that I got from this messy thumbnail all the way to my final piece for Albedo. So first, I always start with a very messy thumbnail just to get the general shape and flow of the entire piece down. I try to keep it really quick and messy just so that I can see the general composition. I found it's helpful to start with the very big shapes and the general composition and then gradually work my way down to the finer details. So you can barely tell what this blob is at this point, but as we move on, you'll see how I refine it. So then once I have that initial thumbnail down and have a good idea of the flow of the piece, flow meaning the movement of the viewer's eye, like where the viewer will look at, I go ahead and start gradually refining it. So I turn the generalized blobs into more humanoid forms, so defining the shape of the hair, the hand, and the figure. So my favorite thing about digital art is the way we can use layers to our advantage. So in my refining process, I take the initial thumbnail layer and lower its opacity. So then on a new layer, I can add more form to the figures while still seeing the overall general composition and flow that I initially made. So for this piece, I wanted my main focus to be on creating a dramatic lighting effect. So making it look like the diamond that's on Albedo's neck is glowing and illuminating everything around it, while the background stays relatively dark. So in order to work towards that end, using the second thumbnail as reference, again lowering the opacity and starting a new layer, I made a value thumbnail. So value refers to how light or dark a color is, and by using only one color, in this case gray, I could focus on the lighting for this layer. So just the lighting, not thinking about the colors, just thinking about where the light's gonna go. I wanted the lighting and posing of the hand, eyes, and hair kind of to be pointing towards that diamond on his neck. So using the shape and lines of like the hand and the fingers and then the strands of the hair like curving down and towards the diamond. I accomplished this by making, in terms of lighting, I accomplished this by making the areas facing the diamond brighter and therefore creating more contrast against the background, which also draws the eye. So more contrast draws the eye, lines directly pointing towards things also draw the eye. Here you see me refining it a little bit more. You can kind of tell it's Albedo now with the value sketch laid out. So again, gradually adding more and more details as we go, doing one small step at a time. And then for small Albedo, I wanted the contrast to be less dramatic from the background, just because I want the main focus to be on the big Albedo. And then eventually the eye leads back down to the smaller one. So for him, the little one, I had less contrast. And still a little bit of like rim lighting to differentiate him from the background, but overall less contrast compared to the big one. So the darks aren't as dark and the brights aren't as bright. And then more contrast again around the face and the hand. And then here I just am sketching out where I want the words to be. Once I got down the value thumbnail, I went ahead and added a more refined sketch on top of that and used the shapes that I made using the value thumbnail as a reference for the sketch. So each time I do a refining pass, I clarify more of the shapes and add a little bit more detail. And I wanted the sketch to create a really good base for my line art later on. So I'm trying to keep it not necessarily super clean because I still want to keep the movement in there, but clean enough that I can tell what's going on. So again, starting from the generalized blobs and then gradually working our way towards the more detailed forms. And at this stage, it's best to think of things in like three-dimensional forms rather than just flat line art, which is why I'm doing it over the value sketch, because the values add a little bit more of that three-dimensional aspect. So I can keep in mind like where things are in the 3D space. So I found this way of working layer upon layer while still being able to see the previous layer allows me to maintain that flow and movement from that initial thumbnail and keep that into the final piece. So here I am continuing to sketch out little Albedo. And again, more detail with the big one and then less detail with the small one, because more detail also draws the viewer's eye compared to less detail. So the main focal point is the big Albedo's facial expression. So in this case, I didn't actually draw a face on the little Albedo because it wasn't important. The only part that was important was like seeing which direction he was facing. So here was that sketch on top of that value thumbnail. Next, I take that sketch, lower its opacity, and then start a new layer. Again, working layer upon layer, and begin drawing the final line art. So for me, having perfectly clean line art isn't a big priority at all. I usually keep it pretty messy still, as long as the shapes are clear and I have variations in line weight, which adds a little bit more of three-dimensionality and a little bit more movement. I'm perfectly happy with it. So in the previous passes, for some reason I started with the big Albedo, and then in this case I started with the small one. I'm not sure why I did that, to be honest. I guess, again, working towards the more generalized shapes and then working towards the details. So small Albedo was overall less detailed compared to big Albedo, so I started with small one. You can see like the general shape of his coat, and I added like star details to again mimic the idea of his neck star diamond shape. I don't know if most people would notice that upon first look at this painting, but I thought it was a nice touch to add some of those diamonds to his coat, and then a diamond of course on the canvas. So I found that this type of not super clean line art suits my rendering style better. Obviously it's not the case for everyone, but for me, I don't have the cleanest art style in general, and I like keeping it that way, to be honest. I like keeping it a little bit more painterly and a little bit rougher, which I found adds a little bit of an extra element of movement. So that's like a key thing you'll see in honestly all of my art, is I really care about having an element of movement and like flow. So feeling of flow and movement is really important to me in my art. Here you can see me, I'm struggling with that hand. I ended up redoing it and not recording the final hand pose. But I kept messing around with the top two fingers, so the pointer finger and the middle finger. I was struggling to get a good position for those two specifically. As you can see here, I ended up changing it from this position. So this position, it looked like Albedo was holding with like a pen, like the index finger looked like a pen, which is not what I wanted, so I ended up changing it later. And then here is a small headcanon that Albedo has, like he's broken his nose before. That's a headcanon that I have, which I don't know if anybody would notice while looking at my painting, but I thought it'd be a fun detail to add. Sort of a headcanon where one of Albedo's experiments has probably gone wrong before in the past, I would guess, and exploded in his face, so then he has a little bit of a bump in his nose. So I know the Genshin model characters, like the models of the characters in game, have like super pointy noses all the time, but I feel like not all the characters should have pointy noses, so I gave Albedo a bit more of a button nose as well as that little bump. And then here I'm lining his hair, just referencing his in-game model as well as his splash art to figure out the shape of his hair. I tried to make it look extra fluffy, kind of mimicking the way Howl's hair looks in the scene where he's catching Calcifer. So this entire painting is actually based off of that a little bit, that scene where Howl is catching Calcifer, the little star, and like holding little star Calcifer to his chest, and it's glowing. So obviously the exact composition is definitely very different, but that scene definitely did inspire this piece. So I was trying to make his hair look extra flowy, and I'm adding all these like more flowy sparks coming from the diamond, again to add more movement and more flow. And then I decided the background was looking a little bit too empty, so then I decided to add some like more shapes. And then the reason why you just saw me change all the background lines to green was just so that I can differentiate it from the characters. So here's what the line art looked like on top of the previous sketch, and then here's after I hid the sketch layer and we're left with the final line art. And then I did the flats off recording. I wasn't recording drawing the flats because I thought that would be boring, but here's what the flats looked like, the flat colors. So I keep each element on its own layer just to save myself some time in the rendering process. I'm not too worried about the initial colors here. As you can see, they're quite muddy, but I just want to get the shapes and composition down how I like it. So if there's anything I'm not happy with compositionally at this stage, I go ahead and adjust it here. So specifically, I adjusted Albedo's hand at this point. Next, I go ahead and start on the rendering. So I did forget to record some of the rendering. I added some sort of light strands in the background, kind of mimicking, I guess, the northern lights, or like those kinds of really smooth clouds you sometimes see in the sky, just to add a little bit more movement. And then I did add some base lighting and like colors to big Albedo and then little Albedo as well. So as per usual, I start with the big shapes, so the big shadows and the big highlights, and then gradually add more and more detail. And since I think I said earlier, I wanted it to look like the light was emitting from Albedo's little diamond in his neck, I'm also adjusting the background to fit that narrative, so lightening and adding saturation to the areas that are near his neck. So with rendering, I usually hop around a lot, as you can see. So I started with the background, now I'm working on the hand, but I still zoom back out a lot of the times just to like see the entire picture and make sure not one section sticks out too much and looks like it's part of a completely different painting. So keeping in mind the big lights and dark shapes that I created earlier, I start adding more and more details. So I add more saturation to like the spot that's in between the shadow and the highlight. So you kind of see that red and the orange in that hand there. So that's more saturation and more color variation. For me, for these types of paintings, I use only one brush, which is that Pencil 3 large 4B Krita brush. And I just change the size of the brush as I get closer and do more and more details, like do more refinement. Start with big brushes and then, or big brush size, and then make it smaller. This brush specifically adjusts its opacity based off of pressure. The size itself doesn't change unless you manually change it. And for me, that mimics paint really well. So if you're new here or you just don't know me that well yet, I originally started art by painting, like traditional art, oil painting, acrylic, and gouache. So when I'm doing digital art, I use similar painting techniques, which is why I like to pick out brushes that are kind of similar and kind of mimic traditional art tools. So the reason why I am adding all those oranges and reds to Albedo's skin tone is not only to make sure it looks like there's blood flowing in his skin, which a lot of the Genshin characters in game do not look like they have blood flowing under their skin, but other than that, I made the oranges and reds saturated because I wanted it to look like that diamond on his neck was emitting a warmer light. So as you can see in the background there, it's also like a more saturated, warmer brown compared to the rest of the background. So this doesn't refer to his skin shading, but I forgot to mention earlier, to make the little light dots streaks appear glowing, I simply brushed over them lightly with that same brush that adjusts opacity according to pen pressure. And I made the light dot streaks closest to the diamond shorter, as well as more saturated to again lead the eye towards the diamond. So quick little, I guess, animation / art fact is the shorter you make the lines, the quicker they look. So the longer streaks look like they're slower, and then the shorter ones look like they're quicker, which is why they draw the eye a little bit more. So then here I'm going ahead and rendering the hair. You'll see later that I ended up redoing his entire hair rendering, and I did end up changing his skin rendering later as well. So then here I'm rendering his eye. I keep it pretty messy, again, common theme here, and I add a little bit of gold specks and orange specks just again to reflect that warm light coming from the diamond and reflecting off of his skin and whatnot. So I wanted the diamond in Albedo's painting to mimic the overall piece, which is why I made it orange. Here's what that rendering looked like at that point. So then here I am, more rendering, figuring out if I want to change the background, because at this point I realized I wanted a little more contrast. So then I added some more contrast in the hair as well by lightening the highlights, and then I wanted to add a bit more color variation with the shadows in his hair. So that's what I did. And again, you'll see later, I ended up completely redoing his hair. But this is what my initial pass looked like with his hair. And this is what I thought I was going to go with until, like, I literally went to bed and then woke up. I was like, wait a second. I want to change his hair. But anyways, that's later in this video. So here I'm rendering the little Albedo, and I'm using similar colors from the big one just to keep his skin tone consistent. And I ended up changing that a little bit more as well, just to put the little Albedo back more into the background, like more shadowed. So here I'm doing some very basic rendering on his jacket and his clothes. Again, keeping little Albedo a lot less detailed with his rendering compared to the big one. Only using a couple colors like per article of clothing and for his hair and whatnot, and just adding a little bit of rim lighting to differentiate him from the background. And then here, I alpha locked all of the line art layers, so I have different line art layers separated out by what part of the piece it is, so little Albedo, big Albedo, background lines, etc. And then I colored the line art to add another dimension of color and light. I keep the line art similar to, but a bit more saturated than the local colors of what I had rendered earlier, and make it either a little bit lighter or a little bit darker to add a little more contrast and readability with the lines. So again, my main focus is adding more movement and then focusing the eye on the parts that I want to have more focus. So for the areas where I want it to be more illuminated by the light, I make the line art a little bit brighter and then also a lot more saturated, whereas the lines in the shadows are a little bit less saturated. And then here I was struggling with the diamond a little bit, but here's what it looked like with the line art colored in. And then here you can see more of my process of coloring in all of those lines. Yeah, so I was coloring in all the background lines and all of the foreground lines, like all of the character lines. And then here I'm coloring in the lines on his hair. Again, making the parts towards facing the light a little bit more saturated and brighter, and then the parts in the shadows a little bit darker. In general, I wanted to have more contrast towards where we see the light, so there's more saturation, more bright colors, and then towards the shadows, less contrast. I also used this method to add some dimension to the words by brightening the words I wanted to put more emphasis on. Next, I worked on the background colors again, specifically around Albedo's diamond, again to draw the eye more towards that diamond. And then at this point, I also started working on like what I call the glow. The more official name is light bloom, so what it looks like when the light reflects off of the particles in the air and adds that like glowing effect. So I put all the light blooms aspects on its own layer on top of everything else, even on top of the line art as well, to sort of soften the line art in some areas and also put emphasis on the parts that I want to put emphasis on, like little Albedo's face where he's facing. And then I add a little bit more shading around the background to make it look more cohesive. So again, focusing the light bloom and the glowing bits more towards where the diamond is, more towards the light source. And here you can see me adding some more saturation to those little light particles. Again, to add a little bit more contrast and to draw the eye. And here you can see me adjusting the text as well, which was again on its own layer and alpha locked. So I brightened the words that I wanted to put more emphasis on and then darkened the ones I wanted less focus on. So then here's what the piece looks like at this point. I thought it was done at this point, and then you'll see I ended up changing my mind and then redid some things because I wanted to add more glow. So you'll see here I'm mostly darkening the background and darkening the shadows. So first I start with the background, and I wanted to add more contrast because the way to make things look like it's glowing and look brighter, one way is to make it brighter, like closer towards white, or another way is to just make the darks darker. So in this case I decided to make the darks darker. So I started with the background, and then you'll see I gradually worked towards the characters. So I darkened the little Albedo to set him more into the background, and then I started darkening the shadows on big Albedo's face, just again to add more contrast and to make that light really look brighter. Because, you know, color and light is always subjective, so to make brights look brighter, make the darks darker. So I'm deepening all of the shadows and then also smoothing out his skin a little bit in some areas. And focusing the darker parts of his skin to be away, facing on planes that are facing away from the light. And then I made it look like he was squinting just a little bit by adding a little eye pouch I suppose is what that would be called. So now he's more illuminated, at least his face and his torso look a lot more illuminated than before, and the contrast is more similar to his hand. So his hand already had decent contrast, but his face and his neck and like his chest area didn't have as much contrast before, and I feel like adding that extra contrast helps a lot. And I was struggling with his ear a little bit there, but see, I figured it out in the end. And then I ended up softening the edges around this little light pool that's around the small Albedo to draw the eye towards little Albedo, to like, you know, little spotlight for him. I softened the edges around that. And then here I started reworking those little light dots from before. I decided to add like cooler tone colors, so like pinks and greens and blues, like really saturated pinks and greens and blues, to make it look like a rainbow kind of, so light shining through a prism creating a rainbow effect. So again, draw the eye a little bit more and to create more contrast. And I've noticed when you add really bright saturated colors, like saturated colors all the way to the bottom right of the color wheel, it makes things look brighter. So here you can see me completely reworking his hair again to be a bit more similar to that initial value thumbnail, so adding more contrast and making the shadowed parts darker to make the bright parts look brighter. And you can see me toggling between the two. It makes such a big difference, just adding a little bit of contrast. And then I also added more saturation in that section that's in between the highlight and the shadow. So I feel that pop of saturation definitely brings Big Albedo more forward in space and draws the eye, and also makes it look more glowing in general, like the whole piece makes it look like he's glowing a little bit more with that golden saturated light. So again, I started with the big shapes of the shadow and light, and then I go back in with a smaller brush size and start getting in some details, focusing the most amount of details towards where it's illuminated, so towards the light part, and then in the shadows keeping it not super detailed, just letting it fall away into the shadows. So again, I zoom in and zoom out a lot, as you see throughout this whole video, so that I can have a good idea on what the overall piece looks like while I work on the small details, and see how each brushstroke affects the entire piece. I mean, it's like life sometimes. You gotta zoom out to see the big picture sometimes. So as I'm working on the details, I zoom out and then zoom back in. Again, adding like more oranges and yellows and those saturated colors in that spot in between the shadows and the bright highlights. And then here I'm reworking the background again. So I darkened the entire background and which meant I had to also darken the light strands that I put in the background, so I'm adjusting those as well. I wanted to add some of those light strands inside of the big light section as well, again to add a little bit more cohesiveness. And then you see here that I'm darkening all of it first to give it a base color, and then I add highlights on top of it so that there's a little bit of color variation and a little bit of value variation in the background, but not so much that it draws the eye and has a lot of contrast. It's just a little bit. And then I toggled back to start working on the light strands emulating from Albedo's neck, so I wanted to add a bit more of that like rainbow effect, as you'll see in a minute here. And I wanted to also emphasize the light particles that are kind of overlaid on top of his neck. So I'm adding some like cooler tone colors to draw the eye and to kind of reflect his eye color as well. And I feel like adding the little rainbow effect definitely worked really well in this case. It draws the eye and it makes those highlights look brighter, even though value-wise they're not actually brighter. It's just the saturation of it draws the eye and makes them appear brighter and makes the highlights appear brighter. So he's got a little rainbow emulating from his neck now. And then I went back and adjusted some final touches on his face. So at this point I'm looking at the entire piece as a whole and adjusting things as I see fit. And then here I honestly struggled a little bit. As you'll see, I decided I wanted to make the area where Albedo is more saturated and more of a warmer color, so you see that change there. So I ended up doing that change not while I was recording, because I was trying to figure out with the color scales, like the sliding scales, which I'm not very familiar with, so I didn't record that bit. But I did use the scales, the color scales, to make the background where Big Albedo is a little bit warmer and a little bit more saturated. So then I'm doing some more final touches to that diamond, adjusting the line art color, again adding some bright saturated colors, and then I realized I forgot to change the color of his eyelashes, so I went ahead and did that here towards the end, and add a little bit more highlights to his eyes. And then at this point I just added more glow in general. So I used a multiply layer, and then kind of following the same shapes that I originally had in the background, I added more of those light strands, kind of to emulate like the northern lights and just to add more of a glowy, airy feeling. And to sort of smooth the transition between the big light spot and the background, so that it's not such a harsh line between Big Albedo section, Little Albedo section. And then here's what the final painting ended up looking like. I really like how it turned out. I'm very proud of how it turned out. It's a very, very big improvement from my last Albedo painting that I made over a year ago. Like, obviously it's not perfect. I already see some mistakes, but it's definitely a big improvement for me, so I'm quite proud of it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting me on Ko-fi, where I have digital downloads like wallpapers and coloring pages, and I also have life log posts as well as garden posts as well as art process scripts. So the script for this video is actually posted on Ko-fi before I made this video. And then I also have my commissions open. So if there's something specific you'd like to see me draw, like a specific character, or you want a pet portrait, or a profile picture for yourself, or a friend, or a loved one, or line art, just let me know. All of my commission info is in my card, which is linked below. So here's more commissions info as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, a comment, follow if you'd like, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.